My name is Kitty Kreisdale, and welcome to the 2021 POOLaide Webinars. Thank you so much for being here today.
A lot of the research that I did leading up to this presentation today, I found many of the dates are all over the place. However, what's consistent is the actions and the life events that folks experienced during their generations really shaped who they were today. So if we start to look at the traditional generation, there's very few left of them in the workplace. They have a strong work ethic and they prefer that face-to-face interaction. They're disciplined and formal. And then we move to the baby boomer generation, right? So these folks are in their 50s and 60s. So those are your managers. They've seen how lifeguarding has evolved. They prefer in-person meetings. They're the ones who started that workaholic trend. Then you get to Gen X. And these folks are in their 40s and 50s. They value continuous skill and learning development, and they're really ruled by a sense of accomplishment. Money is really not a motivation for Gen Xers, and they really like feedback. So you've got your Gen Y or your millennials. So they're in their 30s and 40s. They're super comfortable with technology. They really value teamwork, collective action. We embrace diversity. We're really adaptable to change, and they're confident, right? And these are your emerging leaders as well. So they really just have access to all this technology and diversity in ways to really explore aquatics in a totally different and multiple venues. And then we bring our presentation to Gen Zs. So these are your kids that are lifeguards right now. They're in their teens and their 20s. They value social responsibility and they respond to mentoring and coaching. They are looking for choice and input. They just want to be heard. So we want to be treated like adults. We don't want to be talked down to. They want responsibility and independence and flexibility, but also giving them guidelines and space to do that in choices. And it's important to kind of understand that we might have an unconscious bias and have that mental blind spot. It might conflict with what that person really truly is. Maybe they're an old soul. You know, their generational events don't always define them. Learning how to gen flex, right? So you're going to have to work with different generations. If you understanding the characteristics of each generation, knowing what motivates the generation and being aware of the most important action steps that you need to take for each generation. Who are you targeting? And what is the best venue and verbal and way to approach that? Recognize that there's really no one fits all approach to managing multiple generations. And then if we move into lessons that can be learned from the older generation, things like wisdom, self-awareness, that level-headedness, these are all lessons that can be learned over time and experience. And then if you look at lessons to be learned from the younger generation, the technology, right? They're so fluid with technology. Like they have so many good ideas. They think outside the box. You know, when you're younger and you're like, the older generation just doesn't get it, you know, like I just want to be treated as an adult. And then you fast forward 20 years later and you are an adult and you are the older generation. You look back and you're like, those darn kids. And so it's always the same. But if we can start to step back and appreciate those differences and have some self-awareness and where we're at now and where you were at that point, the generation that you grew up in is not, you can't teach to that generation because that doesn't exist anymore. You got to teach to this generation that's right in front of you. It's just that level of understanding and where they're coming from and using our differences to our advantages.
Men drown at a rate much higher than women. About age 15 to age 54 is where we really see this big uptick. Yet we don't do a ton of education programs at pools that target this older group. We tend to assume that the behaviors we teach children will track into adulthood, when clearly this shows that this is in fact not the case. So we're giving men and women the same programs, yet we're having different outcomes. And this is a theme that I want to keep coming back to, is how despite giving the same program to people, different people take up the same program in different ways. And these can have deadly consequences. So what are the circumstances in which people are drowning? Here, this is for Indigenous people. We can see that daily living is 39%. Right? And these are statistics that we don't tend to see with non-Indigenous people. Being on the water is a way of life. It's a form of transportation. So it says, the swimming pool will be closed today because of a bear in the area. Please do not wait by the pool fence today. And certainly, in all of my years of working at pools in Toronto, I never had to put up a sign like this. So my point about the sign is that the context is different. Yet programs that we teach assume that everything is the same. Water safety marginalizes traditional knowledge and northern expertise. It was assumed that because I had qualifications from Southern Canada, I was the person who should be teaching these programs. Yet local people who didn't have, traditional swimming qualifications, but knew how to actually stay safe on the Arctic Ocean, had no place at the pool. So there's a lot of traditional knowledge that gets ignored when people from non-Indigenous communities come into Indigenous communities and are presented as the experts. Cross-cultural risk communication is really important to look at. There was a community where there were many drownings each year. So the researchers went to a group of elders and they said, we want you to come up with a strategy for how we can decrease drowning. So the elders said a few things. One, they said, okay, we want you to sell float coats at the local store at cost. Then the other thing they said was, we have a message that we'd like you to put out there. Wear your float coat, so if you drown, we won't have to drag the river for your body. Okay, so I would never come up with a message like that. It's pretty dark. But what that message had to its advantage is, one, it came from elders who were trusted. Two, it spoke to the cultural idea of the importance of finding bodies, and that people was taking days or weeks out of people's lives to try to find them. And this was incredibly successful. It decreased drowning by 50% and decreased the cost of search and rescue efforts by, I think it was almost $2 million in a year. So that really goes to show, the importance of cross-cultural communication. Another thing that I found was that aquatic leadership training is deeply problematic, and that there is a lot of institutionalized racism. The town has a pool and the reserve has a waterfront. And what we're finding is that very few of the Indigenous kids from the reserve will go into town to use the pool. And they found that when they went to the pool, there was like this hypervigilance. And so the lifeguards were really hard on them and, criticizing them and just assuming that they were going to be bad kids. The pool was where a lot of the aquatics training happened. But the Indigenous kids who would swim on reserve wouldn't go to the pool to take the training. And so then you'd have to have non-Indigenous people coming into the Indigenous community to run the waterfront. So institutionalized racism is something that we need to think about. And then another thing that I found was the assumption that wearing a life jacket is viewed as feminine behavior or as white behavior. And so when we're telling people, well, just wear a life jacket, we have to think about the ways in which there are colonial connotations of telling people what to wear and how to live their lives. You're yet another person who's not from their community telling them what they should or should not do. We know that there's something going on with masculinity. In general, men tend to judge risks as smaller and less problematic than do women. And they found that males are more likely to take risks than females, but it varies by age and context. I think it has a lot to do with culture and society. We know that the behaviors that make men, quote unquote, men, increase the risk of injury and death and put others at risk too. So we need to consider, when we tell men to wear life jackets, the ways in which that is heavily gendered, and also that there's a cultural component to it as well. So there's intersections there, right? And then we layer on colonialism to this as well. So health communication strategies. There are two that we really should engage with. So one is called a socio-cultural strategy. So that's when you have an in-depth understanding of culturally normative practices and beliefs shared by members of the targeted group. I think the best way to achieve that is by engaging in the next approach, which is constituent involving health communication, which is where you have a collaboration of target group members in the process of program and material development. So if we want to reframe and decolonize Indigenous health in terms of water-related injury, I think we need to consider drowning as a material consequence of colonial relations of power and masculinity, and that we need to address larger underlying relations of power. So, we need to align policy with people's kind of lived experience and saying, it's great to have these public health policies that say you have to have these lifeguarding qualifications, but if they're not truly necessary, how can we disrupt that? Again, taking a community-based approach is really important, as I think the float coat study shows. And I think that if we do all of these things, that we can do constructive damage to the status quo.
Shauna and I have primarily worked in long-term care, but we just want to emphasize that these stories, again, can be applied to all ages and all abilities. We just obviously love seniors here.
Person-centered care is where decisions are based on an individual's unique needs, preferences, and values. So person-centered care looks at the individual's strengths. It focuses on the person as a whole and not their disability or disease. Listen to the individual and show them that their passion, their needs, their interests, that they're important, and lead the way. This one is so important. Others will see your successes in person-centered care and they'll want to follow. So person-directed care goes one step further than person-centered care. Decisions are directed by the individual. They tell you what they want. So person-directed care includes choice, dignity, respect, self-determination, and purposeful living. Oftentimes when we plan a program, we are person-centered. We try to create something that they would enjoy, that brings them value. When we plan person-directed programming, we're truly letting the individual or group lead the program. So we are there to support them. They create their own goals, they contribute their ideas, and they help to execute the activity. They are the experts in what they want. Involve them in the programs and it will be successful. So individuals in your guys' programs may be suffering from loneliness, helplessness, and boredom. They may have joined the program in hopes to alleviate these feelings. During programming, allow individuals to build close and continuing relationships. If you notice individuals that do attend that maybe have anxiety or you notice they're disconnected, finding ways to help build the relationships, whether it be maybe one-to-one or talking to them, asking them what they're looking for in the program. When it comes to combating helplessness, it's to find that balance between giving and receiving care. So invite individuals to contribute to the programming so they can give care as well. The way to combat boredom is variety and spontaneity. Change things up. Have surprise programming, special guests, or fun days. It is important to identify what is meaningful to the person and build upon that. Is it the socialization? Is it the physical activity? Is it getting out of the house? So your role is to help make sure individuals' meanings are met.
So adapting things to suit the needs of individual participants is probably one of the most important contributors to successful inclusion in recreation activities. Essentially, we're all aiming to achieve the same outcome, which is to make sure that participants can get involved and excel in activities in a meaningful way, regardless of the participants' abilities or barriers that they may face. Through all of this, such an important message is it is okay if programs fail. Don't dwell on any failures that you feel like you've experienced. Failure represents an opportunity to reanalyze your goals, adapt your strategies, and advance for further learning opportunities.